Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic of today's webinar is Evaluation of the Stringency and Design of RPSs. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance for the RPS Collaborative, and this webinar is being hosted by Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and he also directs the RPS Collaborative. Before I pass this over to Warren and to our guest speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for today's webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to tune into the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We are going to save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We do expect to have a lot of people attending today's webinar, so that should mean a lot of questions. To make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to submit your question. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours, probably this afternoon, with a link to the webinar slides and the recording, and we'll also be posting those materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar. As I said, our host is Warren Leon, who is the Executive Director of CESA.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Let me first tell you something about CESA. We're a national membership organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies, that work together and cooperate and share information on renewable energy policy and programs. And you could see the logos of our members up here on the screen. We engage in a variety of activities to both help our members and educate a variety of stakeholders. And if we go to the next slide, one of our activities is the RPS Collaborative, which is an offshoot of our core activities through CESA. It's funded from the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and it includes information sharing among state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and a wide range of other stakeholders who are interested in the wonderful world of RPS. We hold webinars like the one today. We have a monthly free newsletter which provides information about renewable portfolio standard news from across the country, and we also produce reports and other publications on renewable portfolio standard issues. If you want to learn more, go to the CESA.org website and go to the project page for the Renewable Portfolio Standard Collaborative. So let's turn to the topic of today's webinar. We're fortunate to have with us two speakers who are among the co-authors on a recent interesting report on the stringency and design of renewable portfolio standards and state energy mandates. And let me give you a little background information about them. Sanya, Carley is an associate professor and chair of the Policy Analysis and Public Finance faculty at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Her research focuses on electricity and transportation policy, as well as on the effects, effectiveness, and unintended consequences of those policies. She has extensive consulting experience with the World Bank, RTI International, ARC Economics, the Nikos Institute, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She's managing editor of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. She will be the prime presenter on the presentation today, but she's joined by one of her co-authors, Nikos Zirogiannis, who is going to help out in the question and answer period and may chime in along the way to provide some other additional information. Now, Nikos is an assistant scientist in the same School of Public Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. He's an environmental economist with a focus on energy policy research and applied economics. His energy policy work ranges from applications in the electricity sector, focusing on things like renewable portfolio standards, in the transportation sector, focusing on things like microeconomic impacts of corporate average fuel economy standards, and in the industry sector, focusing on things like upset emissions from refineries and chemical plants. So these two researchers have produced this very interesting paper that they're gonna tell you about, and I will now turn it over to them.
Great. Thank you so much to both Warren and Samantha for hosting us today. We very much appreciate the opportunity. I am Sanya Carley.
And I'm Nikos Zirogiannis.
And what we will present on today, it's titled The Evaluation of the Stringency and Design of Renewable Portfolio Standards. And this is a study that we published about 2 months ago in the journal Nature Energy. We are also presenting today on behalf of other co-authors that joined us, Lincoln Davies, who's at the University of Utah, and David Spence, who's at the University of Texas at Austin. So what we're talking about today is specifically the RPS, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And I assume that probably all of the attendees today know exactly what an RPS is, but just for the sake of a little bit of background context, allow me to give a stylized depiction of an RPS. Here we have, let's say, a state's energy portfolio or profile in the year 2010. And the objective of an RPS is to increase the amount of renewable energy in that state's portfolio. In this depiction from 2010 to 2025, the state has increased renewables to a total portion of 30% renewables in their portfolio. So this is a command and control regulatory instrument where the state asks the utilities to comply with the mandate by making sure that they have a certain percentage of renewables out of their total electricity mix. Now, renewable portfolio standards were first introduced in the 1990s, and you can see some of the early adopters here in this map. And I'll skip ahead to 2005, where about half of the country, a little less, has a renewable portfolio standard. And then up to 2014, which is the final year of analysis specifically for our study. And you can see that the majority of states have either a mandatory or a voluntary RPS policy. Now, of course, just doing this simple coloring masks the extreme heterogeneity of these policies across space. And here I have the most recent Desire map. This is the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency out of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. Most recently as of February 2017, so this is outdated. You'll note that some states have actually increased their standards since then. But here it shows 29 states plus DC have mandatory policies and 8 states have voluntary. But what's more important to note here is how different these policies are across states. So the mandates range quite significantly across different states, different jurisdictions. So in starting this study, we, of course, began with the literature, and we looked at the literature about how effective the RPS policy is. And this is typically the question that these studies have asked in the past. States have adopted these policies in mass, and we want to know how effective they are. How much renewables have they actually developed? And it turns out that this literature has quite mixed results. Some claim that these standards have no effects, have not increased renewable energy. Others say that they have dramatically increased renewable energy, and then all things in between, which raises the question as to why are there such mixed results? And I think that there are primarily 4, but we could probably identify several other reasons as well. The first, I think, most important reason is the methodological approaches that have been taken in these studies to date, and whether or not these methodological approaches are actually able to get at a causal story with a pretty messy quasi-experimental design. So in short, it's important to use the right methods to answer this kind of question. Another main limitation of this literature is the question about whether or not there's been enough time to actually realize results. So as these policies were first introduced in the 1990s, doing early studies that only go through the early 2000s, for example, might not show the full extent of the possibilities for these standards. A few other things that I'll note is, what about those states that have set mandates equal to the amount of renewable energy that they already have, such in some states that might have a pretty heavy reliance on hydroelectricity, for example, and also how well can these studies actually account for all of the ways that a utility can actually comply with a policy. And there are many different ways that a utility can comply, as this slide shows, at least 6, and once you start thinking about combinations thereof, there's so many different ways. So a utility, of course, could build and deploy its own renewable energy. It could instead purchase credits, renewable energy certificates, or renewable electricity credits off the market. It could pay some kind of alternative compliance payment. It could pay a penalty. It could be excused from compliance because of some kind of cost cap that it hits. It could take advantage of a multiplier, which means that it's deploying more of a certain resource, but less overall of renewables, or again, some combination. So there's a lot of different ways that states can comply, which essentially muddies the statistical approach that researchers could take to study this. In looking at the literature, I think it's also important to ask the question of whether we're asking the right question. So if we're interested in whether utilities are complying, we could actually go and gather that data, just as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory does. I'm assuming that a lot of the attendees are also familiar with this. These are based on compliance reports the utilities put through their public utility commissions. And this graph just shows that on average, the majority of utilities are complying with their policies. The mean is well above 90% in terms of compliance, and the median is even higher. So we know that the answer to the question, are RPSs effective, is in one sense, yes, they are, because utilities are complying. However, we think it's important to dig a little deeper into these kinds of questions about effectiveness. The other thing that's motivating this study and thinking about a limitation in the current literature is coming back to this map that I showed earlier, which is looking at the heterogeneity of these policies. And what the literature has done to date is it tends to summarize all RPS policies as the same. That is, in a statistical analysis, if you have a policy, your state is equal to 1, and if you don't, your state is equal to 0. But what this map really shows is that there's so much more nuance to having a policy, and that accounting for some of this heterogeneity is actually really important. So here we think policy design actually should really matter. And when we're studying this policy, we should ask about policy design. So we think it's time to stop asking the question, are RPS policies effective? And instead asking a more nuanced question, which is, which specific RPS design features make these policies more or less effective? And how do these different designs shape in-state renewable energy markets in different ways? And in particular, this means looking at different kinds of renewable energy market outcomes, such as more solar deployment or more wind deployment, for example, and really thinking about the relationship between how policies are designed and these energy market outcomes. So this is the question that we address in this paper and that I will present today. But before I do so, allow me to give just a little bit more background information about the evolution of policy design. Now, I'm going to claim as we do in this paper, I'm going to claim in this presentation that one of the most important aspects of policy design is how strong the policy is. So here we've captured policy stringency by this equation. And what this equation is saying is essentially it's looking at how much renewables need to be ramped up and over how many years. So the beginning amount of renewables that's in a state, and the difference between that and how much the state sets as their final terminal mandate over the number of years that the state has to comply with that policy. And then this is all multiplied by the percentage of a state's electricity load that's regulated by the policy. So this is our way of essentially excluding the portion of a state that's, let's say, provided, the service is provided by a municipal utility, and that's not regulated through the RPS policy. So using this policy stringency measure that we've come up with, here I show a map of how stringency has changed over time, just to give you a sense of early RPS policies and more recent RPS policies and stringency evolution. So on the left hand of this graph, you see the first year in which a state, the first year in which a state adopted their RPS policy. On the right-hand side of the graph is the final year of our analysis, 2014. Now, some of these states are negative, and that might make you scratch your head. The reason that these states are quite negative is that they had a fairly high percentage of renewables in the beginning year, in the year in which they adopted their policy. For the vast majority of these, it was due to having pretty high rates of hydroelectricity production. Now, the trends here you can see are that generally states have increased their stringency over time. So they've gone and changed their mandates to make them stronger, and that states have over time clumped together more. So there was a lot more of a distribution in the early years, and with the exception of just a few states, the rest of the states have essentially clumped together with these higher stringency scores. Now here's a graph that just isolates those states that actually changed their stringency at some point during the study. So any line for a given state starts in the year in which their policy was first effective, and you can track then how the stringency is increasing over time, and again, clumping together. Excuse me. Now, something else that's happened over time besides a change in the stringency is not only a change in the resources that are eligible for an RPS policy, but also really thinking hard about how to encourage different energy resources. So what this graph shows, this is an image out of a Ryan Weiser report from 2011, and this shows that in the early years of RPS policies, the vast majority of new renewable energy that was deployed to comply with these policies was wind. In fact, it was 94% up through 2009. So this is a time by 2009 where states started to realize that wind was in fact the lowest hanging fruit, and that their RPS policy, even though it was designed as technology neutral, was really strongly encouraging one energy resource and less so others. Now, what happened and what came out of these considerations is an increase in the use of carve-outs and multipliers. So carve-outs essentially allow for a portion of the mandate to count for a very specific eligible resource, usually which is solar or some kind of distributed generation. And a multiplier allows things to count for extra credit, if you will, double or triple. So over time, we've seen more states introduce these carve-outs and multipliers in order to encourage either solar or distributed generation, or possibly to encourage some other resource that the state has a particular natural endowment in, that they would like to use as more or less an economic development effort to make sure that the state goes towards that in-state, that very specific in-state generation source. Now, something else that we've seen, especially increase over time, is the use of other eligible resources to satisfy the renewable portfolio standard. So we've seen the use in some states, we've seen more accurately, we've seen states add to the list of eligible resources things like whole bed methane, nuclear, integrated gasification combined cycle, and other more fossil fuel-based technologies, as well as energy efficiency. Particularly in the later years, we've seen energy efficiency or sustainable energy portfolio standards where energy efficiency can account for a pretty sizable percentage of the RPS. Now, another trend that we've witnessed over time is the increasing use of RECs, renewable energy credits or certificates. And a REC represents 1 megawatt hour of renewable generation, or more accurately, 1 megawatt hour of the environmental attributes of the renewable generation. And the majority of states have RECs and work through open REC markets, but they must confront important questions about how much to restrict the purchase of their RECs. And this leads to a consideration of some trade-offs. If one uses unrestricted RECs, that is, a utility can purchase RECs from any place at any time. This presumably is a least cost option, because if it's cheaper to purchase a REC and to develop the renewables in another state, then it would make sense for a utility to do so. But this raises questions about who's actually recovering the economic development benefits of the policy. If the policy is in one state, but an independent power producer develops the renewables in another state and sells the RECs, then this might be the case that a state is importing the RECs but exporting money. If you restrict the RECs, however, there could be cost implications, as the other side of the coin. But then also states have over time started to have concerns about interfering or introducing complications with the Dormant Commerce Clause. So these are questions that states have grappled with in the design of their REC markets. And what we've seen over time is more states loosen the restrictions on their RECs so that they can be purchased from open REC markets elsewhere. Another design feature are cost mechanisms, and there are a variety of different cost mechanisms in these policies. One is a cost-based escape clause, and this is essentially a clause that allows utilities within the state to not comply with the policy. For example, in the case of Utah, where the policy is that regulated entities must comply so long as it is cost-effective to do so. So this essentially allows an escape clause. Another cost mechanism is a cost cap, and this is a threshold percentage of rates or revenues above which obligated entities no longer need to comply. So once that cost cap is hit, then the utilities don't need to comply. A third is general cost recovery, which allows utilities to recover a percentage, some portion, sometimes full amount, sometimes much smaller, of the RPS compliance costs. And the last cost mechanism is an alternative compliance payment, which is a fee that utilities can pay instead of acquiring the eligible renewable energy, which essentially can function as a cost cap as well. So over time, we've also seen states introduce these various cost mechanisms to ensure cost compliance. Another policy design feature is planning, and as new renewables are being put online, states have recognized the need or the growing importance of having frequent planning processes, particularly with the utility commissions and thinking about capacity expansion and infrastructure planning. So this is yet another common design feature that we've observed states to introduce over time. Now, what this graph shows is all of these different design features that I just went through. And above the axis is adoption rates, and below the axis is revision. So that is anytime a state introduces its policy for the first time and it introduces one of these design features, it will show up above the axis here. Anytime that state then changes their policy in later years, revises it in some way, and introduces one of these new mechanisms or changes their mechanism, you see it below the axis. So several trends to see here. One is just a general trend over time of the increased use of these different design features. You can also see that there are some features that are used more significantly in later years, such as cost recovery and eligible resources, energy efficiency, or non-renewable resources in later years. You also see the use of credit multipliers increase in later years as well, especially following some of the findings of the Ryan Weiser report that I noted before. So I'm going to turn now to our research design, and this is to answer the question that I posed earlier, thinking about how the design of this policy in particular affects certain market outcomes or in-state market outcomes. And the way that we went about approaching this methodologically is with a mixed methods approach. So a portion of it is a statistical analysis using data that's readily available through the Energy Information Administration and elsewhere from 1992, early years predating RPS adoption, to 2014, which at the time that we conducted this analysis was the most recent year of data available. To create this statistical analysis, we also created a very detailed policy design database in which we actually went into the details and into the actual legislation to pull out these different design features. To complement this, we had semi-structured interviews that we conducted with RPS experts across the country. And specifically, those individuals with whom we interviewed, we had respondents from 37 states for a total of 42 respondents. These were conducted over the phone in between 2013 and 2015, and they had quite a long range in terms of time duration, 30 to 80 minutes. And for anybody who's attending this webinar that spoke with us, thank you. We really appreciate your insights. So I'll spend the next several slides just focusing on the statistical results, and then I'll come back to the interviews and talk about how the interviews complemented some of our statistical work. So the methodological approach that we used was a basic regression analysis where our dependent variable, we actually have 4, and I'll tell you about them in a second. We're looking at renewable energy market outcomes in a state in a year. And our variables that we're particularly interested in are the design features. First and foremost, the stringency, but then also a variety of other designs, as I just covered. We also control for other state level characteristics, such as the economic climate of the state and the political climate and other features. We control for time and state fixed effects. So this is essentially controlling for the state level fixed effects. It's time invariant. It's factors within a state that might lead to renewable energy outcomes that don't actually change over time. So our dependent variables, we use 4 because I noted early on that it's really important to consider a variety of different renewable energy market outcomes, not just focus specifically on one, such as renewable energy. So the 4 are percentage of renewable energy production, solar generation, wind generation, and renewable energy capacity. And the primary independent variable is the stringency of the policy. So again, I'm introducing this equation that I showed you earlier. The question here is, how much does the strength of a policy affect certain market outcomes? Now, other variables that we include in the model, here's a long list of the policy design features that we include. So whether energy efficiency is allowed or other non-renewables are allowed, whether there are credit multipliers, penalties, what the mandate amount is, whether the policy is mandatory or voluntary, how long the policy has been in place, whether there are cost recovery mechanisms, how frequently there are planning activities, and the last 2 pertain to rec markets in particular, whether they engage in rec markets and whether or not there are geographic limits placed on compliance. And as I noted a minute ago, there are also a variety of control variables, economic and political in particular. So turning to the results, I thought instead of putting up regression models, which might be a little too much in the weeds, that I would give you a listing of the main results. So the first and most important result that we have in the study is that strong mandates, highly stringent mandates, are very important for solar and renewable energy in general. That is, the stronger the policy, the more stringent the policy, the more a state should expect from in-state renewable energy and solar in particular. The longer a state has an RPS policy in place, the more it deploys solar. Third, there are other things besides just policy design that matter, and in particular, when it comes to wind, economic conditions are especially important, so having a strong economic climate. Fourth, having some kind of cost recovery mechanism leads to higher rates of renewables. Fifth is those states that hold frequent planning activities tend to have more wind and general renewables as well. And sixth, tighter geographic restrictions are associated with more in-state wind generation. Though I think it's really important to note that this relationship could, of course, go in both directions. So states can choose whether or not to place geographic restrictions on their policies, depending on the amount of a wind or a solar resource that they actually have. So those are the regression results. Let me talk a little bit about the interview results and the semi-structured interviews. So we actually began these interviews by asking the very general question of, are RPS policies effective? And this is just a very rough breakdown. Approximately 74% of our sample said yes, 8% said no, and 18% said, well, maybe, but of course it depends. What do you actually mean by effective? Which I was thrilled to hear. Pretty much everyone with whom we spoke, even those that said yes and no, said, we need to qualify this. You can't just ask about effectiveness. which is great. So of course we had these other questions about, well, okay, can you talk to us about what it is that is leading to how you've designed your policy and how that leads to certain market outcomes. So here are the four main things that we found through these interviews. And I think that these really reaffirm the findings that we have on the statistical side as well. So the first is about actually setting the mandate. And the advice that we were given or that we learned is the mandate should be well above current and readily attainable levels of renewable energy, because you don't want to actually artificially constrain the market. So if you already have, let's say, 5% renewables, it's not a good idea just to set the mandate at 7%, because that might actually lead utilities to only go up to 7% as opposed to beyond that 7%. Also, mandates should be ambitious but attainable. So the mandates shouldn't be so extreme that the states can't actually achieve them. One thing that I think is quite interesting is if you think back to the stringency graph that I showed you earlier, a lot of states introduced fairly low mandates in early years and made sure that they were able to achieve them. And then a few years before achieving them, or a few years into their policy implementation, they ratcheted it up once they had the confidence of the utilities, but also the citizens within the state. The second main insight here is about flexibility, and that is to ensure that the policy is as flexible as possible. And one of the ways to do this is to introduce policy design features such as REC, banking, and borrowing. So allowing utilities to comply with the policy in the most cost-effective manner possible, maybe banking and borrowing from future or past years. The third main insight is about transparency and how important it is to have transparency, specifically when it comes to REC markets. So it's important to ensure a dependable and transparent REC trading system with prices that aren't too low. Again, this is the idea that prices that are too low might artificially constrain the market or not appropriately incentivize it. And this same idea is really picked up in this last point as well. So thinking about other policy design features and characteristics, it's important for the state to also avoid constraining the markets in other ways. Excuse me. So making sure that penalties, alternative compliance payments, and cost caps are all set high enough so that they don't supplant the new renewable energy development that could actually be deployed. So these interviews, I think, really featured some important trade-offs that I'd like to take a moment to think about. One is coming back to the idea of REC markets and whether or not to restrict these REC markets. As I noted before, there are some pretty inherent trade-offs here about cost effectiveness versus economic development. And these trade-offs were featured quite heavily in our interviews. Another trade-off that I think the last slide really speaks to is weighing the benefits and the costs of policy modification versus regulatory stability. And what I mean here is if we look at the trends of how these policies have changed over time, we can note that states have modified their standards quite a bit. They've modified them to adapt to their own specific circumstances and to improve upon past performance. For example, modifying some design features to make sure that they can overcome some of the challenges that they had before. Now, this seems like good regulatory practice objectively, but it's important to note that the more often that these policies are modified, it might suggest that that there is a degree of regulatory uncertainty, that these policies might continually be modified or continually up for debate and discussion and changed. So this is the trade-off of how often to modify and how much regulatory stability to provide. So just a few concluding thoughts about the study. The really important takeaway message, important finding that we have across both of our methodological approaches is that policy design matters. In particular, having a stringent policy is particularly important. But of course, there are other factors that are important as well. It would be completely naive to disregard all the other factors. And in particular, economic conditions are important for wind generation. And that as states continue to design and implement and revise their policies over time, there are a variety of trade-offs that are inevitable that states will need to consider and grapple with. And of course, having amazing open forums and organizations such as this one that can help people process the design of RPS policies is crucial. So here are the references that I've used in this just in this presentation today, but I encourage you to go to the study itself if you're interested in more detail, if you'd like to look up the regression results, for example, or see more detail. In fact, the link to the paper, as of the last time I used this link, the paper was still available for free access using this link. So I encourage you to use it if you're interested in reading more. And with that, we can open it up to questions.
I want to thank Sanya for a very good and clear presentation. Let me go through the questions. The first one goes back to the beginning where you ranked the various RPSs in terms of their stringency, and you had some that had negative numbers, and someone asked, they didn't understand how an RPS could have a negative value for stringency. They understood it having a low value for stringency, but how could it have a negative value?
Thank you for that question. So I wouldn't read too much into negative versus positive. That's just a function of the equation that we created. You could think of it just as a continuum all the way from negative to positive. If you pushed it into the positive, it would still be a continuum. But the reason that those states actually have quite negative scores is to create that variable, we used Energy Information Administration data on the actual percentage of renewable energy production, including hydroelectricity, in the year in which the state first adopted the policy. So those states with quite negative values actually had fairly high, I think the majority of them at least, had fairly high rates of hydroelectricity deployment in the year in which they adopted the policy. Or rather, the year that that policy was first effective.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And you said strong economic conditions are important for high rates of wind development. And someone was asking, they understand the words, but don't know, what do you really mean by that? What do you mean strong economic conditions are important?
GDP is in particular quite important. So the higher rate of GDP, the more wind a state will experience. One could also clump into that renewable energy resources, which is, it's actually captured in a term in our statistical analysis that's called the state fixed effect. But this term is quite statistically significant. So the more wind endowment that a state has, the more wind they should expect to deploy, quite logically.
Okay. So you were looking at differences in GDP growth among states when you were looking at that?
That's correct.
Okay, great. And then the next thing follows up on something that you had just referred to, which had to do with the available wind or solar resource in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And someone was asking, you know, obviously some states have better resources than others. How did you factor that in? And can't the available resource swamp the issue of the stringency of the state's policy?
So the natural resource endowment of every state is captured by the state fixed effect. So there's a term there in the equation that accounts for time invariant characteristics of every state. One of those time invariant characteristics is this natural resource endowment, amount of potential wind generation, amount of solar activity that can be harnessed, right? So yes, I think, and that is recorded in the paper. So I think the coefficient in the stringency variable, I think the percentage of the variation that captures is around 3 to 5% R squared. But yes, a significant part of the variation that helps explain differences in renewable generation is captured by the state fixed effects, meaning by the endowment of every state in terms of renewable capacity.
And I think it's also important to note that simply by controlling for it in the regression model, the fact that the stringency is still significant suggests that we've accounted for how much wind or solar endowment a state has, and the policy design still matters.
Okay, good. And how did you address the fact that, you know, most states allow projects, not just in state, but at least in nearby states to qualify for their RPS. How did you factor in development that might occur in a state, but that is used to meet another nearby state's RPS?
So this is an important methodological challenge that very few in the literature have been able to accurately capture. And I would say that this study doesn't attempt to do so. In the research question, you may recall that the question was, how do these design features affect in-state renewable market development? So we're very specifically looking at what's happening in-state. So any of these results, particularly the statistical results, one should recall, this is just about how does your design affect what's happening in your state, not how is it affecting what's happening outside of your state. Now, I think that the interviews get at some of those other details because you're able to take, when you're actually talking with people, you're able to take a much more holistic picture than if you just run a statistical regression, for example.
Okay. And, you know, your research ended in 2014. Since that time, the cost of both solar and wind technology has gone down. Some states are reaching their maximum RPS target, while other states have significantly increased their final target. In other words, you know, some states, in effect, if you were to do your graph of stringency, they've moved up on the stringency scale, and others have stayed where they are or even moved down. Do you have any reason to think that if you were to update your analysis to 2018, you would get similar results, or is there any reason to think that the results could be different?
That's a fabulous question. Maybe Nikos and I can each take a stab at it because we may or may not have the same thought. But my initial reaction is that the results would hold. They would be quite consistent. And in particular, you would see the variable where you control for time to become even more important. And so that variable would really pick up on the dramatic decrease in the price, particularly of solar, but also of wind in recent years. I do think one complication with wind is planning and siting, and so not to say that we've slowed down in any direction, but the planning variable actually might be more important in recent years than it was in past.
Correct, and I guess it will depend on what kinds of changes we have seen between 2014 and 2018, and I think those changes, if they were present in the stringency of the RPS, could, yes, perhaps affect the results a little bit if we were to extend the analysis to 2018. But one, we have to look at how the stringency scores of different states would have progressed.
That's right.
And we would have to wait a little bit to get the data on the more recent years to do that kind of an analysis.
Very good. Well, I'm going to give people 1 minute more to write any additional questions. I've gone through the questions that have come in so far. I'm going to give Sanya and Nikos an opportunity to have some famous last words and to emphasize any points that they want to emphasize, or to say anything that you haven't had a chance to say up till now.
One thing
so I'll turn it to Nikos and Sanya to do that, and then we'll see if there are any other questions, and if there aren't other questions, we'll call it a day.
One thing I wanted to add, Warren, to your question earlier about the effects that an RPS has on generation in an outside state, meaning in a non-RPS state. As Sanya mentioned, our paper looked at in-state effects of RPS policies, but one of our colleagues here in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, Alex Hollingsworth, has just recently published a paper exactly addressing that question. And I think we referenced this paper in our study. I think it's the number 4 reference in the list of citations. And that study shows that an increase in RPS mandate in a given state can reduce coal generation in an out-of-state area. So a non-RPS state that is neighboring to an RPS state will experience a reduction in coal generation and an increase in renewable energy because of the increase of the RPS mandate in an RPS state. Just a little plug-in for one of our colleagues' research that addresses that question specifically.
Good, but can I follow up on that for a second? I mean, that actually is very interesting, but I think the question I was asking before is slightly flipped from that. It was partially asking, you know, say for example, looking at New England, and there's been in-state development of renewable energy in New Hampshire, and some of that development of renewable energy of New Hampshire has been because not the New Hampshire RPS, but because of the Massachusetts RPS, which has purchased RECs from those New Hampshire projects. Is there a way in which you're able to factor out that development in New Hampshire when evaluating the effectiveness of the New Hampshire RPS?
Not in our study, though our colleague's study really does get at that exact issue, with the caveat that this study doesn't actually look at design features. So the next step would be to combine our efforts and to focus on design features as well as both in-state and out-of-state developments. I will note that I've attempted to do this as well by tracking RECs, and it's incredibly difficult to track RECs, so this really does speak to the transparency issue, to track prices as well as where RECs are traded from one to another state. So this is just, as a researcher, a call for more transparency of information so that we can actually document some of those in-state and out-of-state effects. Good.
And Sanya, do you have any additional comments or observations you want to make?
I do, thank you. I would be thrilled to hear from anybody who's on the webinar who has insights into their specific state policies or into these policies in general. I think there's a need for research and practice to be as integrated as possible. And so please, by all means, don't hesitate to reach out to me with ideas, thoughts, or suggestions.
Hey, thanks for saying that. And, you know, I want to make an observation and to thank you, not just for this webinar, which I think has been very interesting, but for your research. You know, it's been very hard to really assess the effectiveness of these policies, and your research is noteworthy for its sophistication and for it getting beyond just simple measures of are the states reaching their targets or not. And so it's really good that academic researchers like yourselves are giving attention to evaluating the effectiveness of what has been important policies. So thank you for that. And I want to thank everybody on the call for joining the webinar today and listening in, and we will have future webinars that you will hear announcements about in future weeks and months. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Warren.
Thank you.